The storm came without warning, black clouds rolling across the Texas plains like an army of shadows. Caleb Harrow didn't know that saving a stranger's life that day would destroy everything he'd built to protect himself from feeling again. He didn't know the woman buried under that overturned wagon would become the only person who could save his dying ranch, or break through the walls he'd spent 3 years building around his heart. This is a story about debt, survival, and the stubborn courage it takes to fight for something worth keeping. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The dust came first. It always did on the Texas frontier, rolling across the open plains like a living thing, hungry and relentless. Caleb Harrow had learned to read the sky the way some men read books. Every cloud, every shift in the wind told a story. And on this particular afternoon in late August, the story the sky was telling was a dangerous one. He'd been riding fence line on the eastern edge of Iron Ridge when he saw it, a wall of brown-black chaos churning toward him from the north, swallowing the horizon whole, the kind of storm that could strip paint off buildings and bury a man where he stood if he wasn't careful. Caleb pulled his hat down tight and turned his horse toward home, but something stopped him. A sound, faint beneath the rising howl of wind, the sharp crack of wood splintering, the terrified scream of horses, and then a woman's voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Help! Someone, please!" Every instinct told him to ride away. Strangers meant complications, and complications meant risk. Caleb Harrow had spent the last 3 years of his life building a careful, calculated distance between himself and anything that might crack the armor he'd wrapped around his grief. But that voice, desperate, furious, refusing to surrender, pulled something loose in him. He kicked his horse hard and rode straight into the teeth of the storm. The scene he found was chaos. A merchant wagon had overturned on the narrow trail, its canvas torn to shreds by the wind, crates and barrels scattered across the dirt like toys thrown by an angry child. 2 horses thrashed in their traces, eyes rolling white with panic. And beneath the wreckage, barely visible through the swirling dust, was a woman. She was pinned under the wagon's frame, one arm free and clawing at the dirt, her face streaked with blood and dust. Her hair, dark, wild, whipped around her face like she was drowning in it. "Hold on," Caleb shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the wind. He dismounted fast, tying his horse to what was left of the wagon's axle. The dust was so thick now he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. He dropped to his knees beside the woman and grabbed the edge of the wagon frame. "Can you move?" he yelled. "Does it look like I can move?" She snapped back, and despite everything, despite the storm and the blood and the danger, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Fair point. He braced himself against the wagon and pushed upward with everything he had. The frame groaned but didn't budge. The woman hissed in pain, and Caleb saw why. Her leg was twisted at an angle that made his stomach turn. "Don't you dare quit on me now," she said through gritted teeth, as if he were the one trapped under 1,000 pounds of splintered wood and cargo. "I'm not quitting," Caleb muttered. "I'm thinking. Think faster." He repositioned himself, planted his boots in the dirt, and tried again, this time using the wagon's tilt to his advantage, levering it up inch by agonizing inch. The woman bit down on her own sleeve to keep from screaming as she dragged herself free, pulling her injured leg out from under the wreckage just as Caleb's strength gave out and the wagon crashed back down. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just sat there in the dirt, gasping for air, while the storm raged around them like the world was ending. "Can you ride?" Caleb asked. The woman looked at him like he'd just suggested she sprout wings and fly. "I can barely breathe." "That's not what I asked." She glared at him, a look sharp enough to cut glass, but then nodded. "If you can get me on a horse, I'll stay on it." Caleb didn't waste time arguing. He hauled her up by her good arm, ignoring her sharp intake of breath as her injured leg buckled beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, but stronger too. She didn't faint, didn't collapse, just locked her jaw and let him half carry, half drag her to his horse. Getting her into the saddle was a brutal, awkward process. She hissed curses under her breath the entire time. Some he recognized, some he didn't. But she didn't quit. Once she was up, Caleb swung up behind her, wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her from sliding off, and kicked the horse into motion. The storm swallowed them whole. It took an hour to reach the nearest shelter, an abandoned line shack on the edge of what used to be Brennan territory, back before the Brennans lost everything and disappeared west. The shack was half collapsed, but the roof still held, and that was all that mattered. Caleb carried the woman inside and laid her down on the dirt floor as gently as he could. She didn't pass out, but she came close. Her face was pale beneath the dust and blood, her breathing shallow. "Stay still," Caleb said, though it wasn't clear if he was talking to her or himself. He checked her leg first. It wasn't broken, not quite, but it was badly sprained, swollen, and already turning dark with bruising. He wrapped it as best he could with strips torn from his own shirt, working quickly and efficiently while the storm hammered against the walls outside. The cut on her forehead was worse, deep enough to scar, bleeding steady. Caleb cleaned it with water from his canteen and pressed a clean cloth against it until the bleeding slowed. "You're lucky," he said quietly. The woman opened one eye and looked at him like he'd just said the dumbest thing she'd ever heard. "Lucky? Could have been worse." "I was crushed under a wagon in the middle of a dust storm," she said flatly. "Forgive me if I don't feel blessed." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. He sat back against the wall, exhausted, and watched her through the dim light filtering through cracks in the boards. She was maybe 30, give or take, old enough to have seen hard years, young enough to still be fighting them. Her hands were calloused, her clothes practical and worn. Not a traveler passing through for fun. A worker. Someone who knew how to survive. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. The woman hesitated, as if deciding whether he'd earned the right to know. Finally, she said, "Eliza. Eliza Hartley." "Caleb Harrow." "Well, Mr. Harrow," Eliza said, her voice rough but steady. "Looks like I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything. That's not how debts work." Caleb didn't argue. He just tipped his hat down over his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall, listening to the storm rage outside. He'd saved her life, yes, but he'd done it without thinking, without planning, and now he didn't know what to do with the aftermath. He never did. But by the time the storm passed, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. Caleb helped Eliza back onto his horse. She didn't complain this time, though he could see the pain in every movement, and they rode in silence toward the nearest town. But when they reached the fork in the road, Eliza spoke. "Where are you headed?" "Iron Ridge," Caleb said. "My ranch. It's about 10 miles south." Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Drop me in town. I'll figure it out from there." "You can barely walk." "I'll manage." Caleb didn't doubt it. Everything about Eliza Hartley screamed survivor, the kind of person who'd crawl through broken glass if that's what it took to keep moving. But something about leaving her alone in a town where she knew no one, injured and broke, didn't sit right with him. "There's a doctor in town," Caleb said carefully, "but he's expensive and slow." Eliza snorted. "Of course he is." "Or," Caleb continued, ignoring her, "you could come to Iron Ridge for a few days. Let that leg heal. We've got a bunkhouse, food, and space." Eliza twisted in the saddle to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why help me? You already saved my life. Most men would call that debt paid." Caleb didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't want to say it out loud, that he recognized something in her, something stubborn and broken and still fighting, that reminded him too much of himself. "Consider it an extension of the original rescue," he said finally. Eliza stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes sharp and searching. Then, slowly, she nodded. 5 days, she said. "I'll stay 5 days to let this leg heal. Then I'm gone." "Deal." And that was how Eliza Hartley came to Iron Ridge. Iron Ridge had once been something to be proud of. 10 years ago, when Caleb and his wife Anna first built the ranch, it had been a thriving operation, cattle grazing on rich grassland, a bunkhouse full of loyal hands, a main house that echoed with laughter and warmth. Anna had planted flowers by the porch. She'd hung curtains in every window. She'd made the place feel alive. Then the fever came. It swept through the frontier settlements like a scythe, taking women and children first. Anna fought it for 6 days before her body gave up. Caleb buried her on the hill overlooking the valley, beneath a cottonwood tree she'd loved. After that, Iron Ridge began to die with her. The flowers withered. The curtains came down. The laughter stopped. One by one, the ranch hands drifted away, some to better opportunities, some because they couldn't stand working for a man who'd turned into a ghost. Now, 3 years later, Iron Ridge was a shadow of itself. The bunkhouse held only 16 men, half the number it used to. The cattle herd had shrunk. The fences needed mending. The main house stood dark and cold, its rooms filled with dust and silence. And the kitchen, the heart of any working ranch, had become a graveyard. 4 cooks had tried to work there in the past year. None lasted more than a week. The men complained the food was terrible, the supplies were scarce, and the whole place felt cursed. Caleb didn't argue. He knew the ranch was failing. He just didn't care anymore. Until Eliza Hartley limped through the front gate on a borrowed crutch and looked around with an expression that was equal parts disgust and determination. "This," Eliza announced to no one in particular, "is a disaster." Caleb, who was helping her down from the wagon, paused. "Excuse me?" "Your ranch," Eliza said bluntly. "It's a disaster. You've been here 30 seconds. That's all it takes." Caleb bit back a response and led her toward the main house. The ranch hands, 16 hard, weathered men who'd seen too many seasons of struggle, stopped what they were doing to stare at the stranger. A woman on Iron Ridge was rare enough. A woman who looked like she'd been through hell and back was something else entirely. "Who's she?" asked Gideon Pike, the foreman, as he approached. Gideon was a tall, lean man in his 40s, with a face like carved stone and eyes that missed nothing. He'd worked for Caleb since the beginning, back when the ranch was still something worth believing in. Now he ran things with grim efficiency, keeping the place functional even as it slowly bled out. "Eliza Hartley," Caleb said. "She'll be staying a few days. She got caught in the storm yesterday." Gideon's gaze flicked to Eliza's bandaged leg, then back to Caleb. "We taking in strays now?" "Just until she heals." Eliza, who'd been leaning on her crutch and listening to this exchange with an increasingly irritated expression, spoke up. "I'm standing right here, you know." Gideon ignored her. "Where's she sleeping?" "Bunkhouse has space," Caleb said. "No, it doesn't." "Then make space." Gideon's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness and walked away, leaving Caleb and Eliza standing in the dusty yard. "He's delightful," Eliza said dryly. "He's practical." "He's rude," Caleb almost smiled. "That too." He led Eliza to the main house and showed her to a small room on the ground floor, once a guest room, now just another empty space collecting dust. Eliza sat down on the bed with a heavy sigh, her injured legs stretched out in front of her. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb nodded and turned to leave, but Eliza's voice stopped him. "Your kitchen," she said. "When's the last time someone cooked a real meal in there?" Caleb's shoulders tensed. "Why?" "Because I walked past it on the way in, and it looks like it hasn't been used in months. We've had trouble keeping a cook." "I can see why." Eliza paused, then said, "Let me cook tonight." Caleb turned back to face her, confused. "What?" "I'm a cook," Eliza said simply. "That's what I do. I've worked kitchens from Santa Fe to St. Louis. Let me cook one meal for your men tonight. If they hate it, I'll leave before sunrise and you'll never see me again." "You're injured." "I can stand." "Barely." "It's enough." Eliza's dark eyes locked onto his, steady and unflinching. "You saved my life, Mr. Harrow. Let me pay that debt the only way I know how." Caleb wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her the kitchen was cursed, that the men wouldn't appreciate it, that it wasn't worth the effort. But something in Eliza's expression, a quiet, fierce determination, made him hesitate. "One meal," he said finally. Eliza smiled. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it changed her entire face. One meal. By late afternoon, word had spread through the ranch. The stranger woman was cooking dinner. The men gathered in the bunkhouse like a jury, skeptical and unimpressed. Most of them had been through this before. Some optimistic newcomer trying to fix the ranch with good intentions and bad cooking. It never worked. "She'll be gone by morning," muttered Finn Garrett, a young hand with a perpetual scowl, just like the others. "Maybe," said Lucas Webb, an older cowboy with a graying beard, "but I'm curious to see what she can do with the scraps we've got left." "Scraps is right," Finn said bitterly. "Pantry's practically empty. Boss hasn't ordered supplies in weeks." Gideon, sitting in the corner sharpening his knife, didn't look up. "If she's smart, she'll quit before she embarrasses herself." But Eliza Hartley wasn't smart in the way Gideon meant. She was smart in the way survivors were, resourceful, stubborn, and unwilling to back down from a challenge. She'd spent the afternoon in the kitchen taking inventory of what little supplies remained: half a sack of flour, some dried beans, a few eggs, a tin of lard, some withered vegetables, and miraculously, a jar of peaches someone had forgotten about. Not much, but enough. By the time the sun set, the smell of cooking food began to drift across the ranch yard, rich, savory, impossible to ignore. One by one, the men emerged from the bunkhouse and made their way to the dining hall. The dining hall was a long, low building adjacent to the main house, with rough wooden tables and benches worn smooth by years of use. It hadn't been full in months. Most of the men ate in shifts or grabbed cold rations and scattered. But tonight, all 16 of them filed in and sat down. They didn't talk. They just waited. Caleb sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Gideon sat across from him, arms crossed, looking like a man waiting for a verdict. Then Eliza emerged from the kitchen. She was limping, leaning on her crutch, but her arms were full. Platters of food balanced with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. She set them down on the table one by one. Fried chicken, crispy and golden. A thick stew made from beans and vegetables. Cornbread still steaming from the oven. And impossibly, a peach cobbler that smelled like summer. The men stared. "Eat," Eliza said simply, and disappeared back into the kitchen. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lucas Webb, who'd been working ranches for 30 years and had no patience for ceremony, reached for a piece of chicken, took a bite, and closed his eyes. "Sweet mercy," he muttered. That broke the dam. The men tore into the food like they hadn't eaten in days. Maybe because they hadn't, not like this. They passed platters, filled bowls, and for the first time in years, the dining hall was loud again. Not with complaints or arguments, but with the simple, honest noise of men enjoying a good meal. Finn Garrett, who'd been so certain Eliza would fail, stared down at his plate in stunned silence. Then he looked up and said, "Where the hell did she learn to cook like this?" "Does it matter?" Lucas replied, his mouth full of cornbread. Even Gideon, stone-faced, skeptical Gideon, reached for a second helping of stew without a word. Caleb sat at the head of the table, watching it all unfold, and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried on that hill beneath the cottonwood tree. Hope. Eat. After the meal, Caleb found Eliza in the kitchen, sitting on a stool with her injured leg propped up, staring at the empty platters with a satisfied expression. "They liked it," Caleb said quietly. Eliza glanced at him. "I know." "How?" "Because they're still here." She gestured toward the dining hall, where the men were still lingering, talking and laughing in a way Caleb hadn't heard in years. Men don't stick around after a bad meal. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did." "Why?" Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Because I know what it feels like when a place is dying, and I know what it takes to bring it back." Caleb studied her, this strange woman who'd blown into his life on a dust storm, and somehow, in the space of one evening, reminded his men what it felt like to be cared for. "Stay," he said suddenly. Eliza looked up, surprised. "What?" "Stay longer than 5 days. Stay as long as you need." And Caleb hesitated, then added, "We need a cook, and you're the best one we've had." Eliza's expression was unreadable. "Your men don't trust me yet. They will. Your foreman hates me." "He hates everyone." Eliza laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like light breaking through clouds. Then she sobered and said, 1 week. I'll stay 1 week. After that, we'll see. Caleb nodded. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. Attacked. That night, after the men had gone to bed and the ranch had fallen silent, Caleb stood on the porch of the main house and looked out at the dark expanse of Iron Ridge. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night. For the first time in 3 years, Caleb didn't feel like he was drowning. He didn't know if Eliza Hartley would stay. He didn't know if one good meal could fix a ranch that was falling apart. But tonight, just for tonight, Iron Ridge had felt alive again. And that was enough. Inside the guest room, Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her leg throbbed, her body ached, and every rational instinct told her to leave as soon as she could walk. But she'd seen something tonight. In the men's faces, in the way they'd laughed and eaten and come back to life. She'd seen what a place could become when someone cared enough to fight for it. And despite every wall she'd built, despite every reason she had to run, she wanted to see what happened next. The first test came on the third morning. Eliza woke before dawn, as she always did, and made her way to the kitchen on her crutch. Her legs still ached, but the swelling had gone down enough that she could put weight on it if she was careful. The ranch was quiet at this hour, just the soft sounds of horses stirring in the stables and the distant call of a mourning dove. She lit the lamps and surveyed the kitchen with a critical eye. It was cleaner than it had been 3 days ago, but still a mess by her standards. Pots hung haphazardly from hooks, the stove needed a proper scrubbing, and the pantry was a disaster of mismatched containers and poorly stored supplies. But it was hers now, at least for the next few days. She started breakfast the way she'd started every meal since arriving, by taking inventory. 3 dozen eggs, enough flour for biscuits, some salt pork that needed using before it turned, and a handful of wrinkled apples that could be salvaged with sugar and cinnamon. By the time the sun crept over the eastern hills, the smell of coffee and frying bacon had filled the ranch yard, and the men began to emerge from the bunkhouse like bears waking from hibernation. They filed into the dining hall without speaking, but their eyes were different now, less skeptical, more curious. Eliza served them hot biscuits with gravy, fried eggs, bacon, and apple fritters that made Lucas Webb groan out loud. "Ma'am," he said, "if you leave this ranch, I'm following you." A few of the younger hands laughed. Even Finn Garrett, who'd been so certain she'd fail, cracked a smile. But Gideon Pike sat at the far end of the table, stone-faced as ever, eating in silence. When he finished, he stood, placed his plate in the wash bin without a word, and walked out. Eliza watched him go, her jaw tight. "Don't mind Gideon," Lucas said quietly. "He's been that way since the boss's wife died. Doesn't trust change." "I'm not asking him to trust me," Eliza replied. "I'm just asking him to eat." "Well, he did that, so I'd call it progress." After breakfast, Caleb found Eliza in the pantry, taking notes on a scrap of paper with the stub of a pencil. She'd organized the shelves into some kind of system he didn't understand. Flour and grains on one side, canned goods on the other. Dried herbs hanging from nails she'd hammered into the wall herself. "You didn't have to do all this," Caleb said. Eliza didn't look up. "Yes, I did. Your pantry was a nightmare." "It functioned." "Barely." She finished writing and turned to face him, leaning on her crutch. "Mr. Harrow, when's the last time you ordered supplies?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "A few weeks ago." "Try 2 months." Eliza tapped her notes. "I checked your delivery records. You're running on scraps. Another week, and your men will be eating plain beans and stale bread." "We've managed." "You've survived," Eliza corrected. "There's a difference." Caleb's expression hardened. "Supplies cost money, and money's tight right now." "How tight?" "That's not your concern." Eliza studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes sharp. "You know what kills a ranch faster than drought or disease? Hopelessness. Men who don't believe there's a future worth fighting for, and you can't build hope on empty stomachs." Caleb wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because she was right. He'd watched his men grow quieter, grimmer, more defeated with each passing month. He told himself it was just the way things were now, that grief and hardship had carved something permanent into Iron Ridge, but 3 days of good food had changed something. The men were talking again, laughing, working harder. It was small, fragile, and Caleb didn't trust it yet, but it was there. "I'll put in an order this week," he said finally. Eliza nodded. "Good. And next time, let me see the books first. I can stretch supplies better than whoever's been doing your purchasing." "That would be me." "Then you need help." Caleb almost smiled despite himself. "You're awfully bold for someone who's been here 3 days. I'm awfully practical for someone who's seen a dozen ranches fail for the same stupid reasons." Eliza limped past him, heading back toward the kitchen. "You saved my life, Mr. Harrow. The least I can do is keep your men fed while you figure out how to save your ranch." That afternoon, Gideon finally confronted her. Eliza was outside, sitting on a bench near the well, peeling potatoes into a bucket. Her injured leg was stretched out in front of her, and she worked with the efficient, practiced movements of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. Gideon approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. "Miss Hartley." Eliza didn't look up. "Mr. Pike." "We need to talk." "I'm listening." Gideon was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he said, "The men like you. That's good. But liking someone and trusting them are different things." "I'm aware." "Are you?" Gideon stepped closer. "This ranch has been through 4 cooks in the past year. All of them started strong. All of them quit when things got hard. And things always get hard." Eliza set down her knife and finally looked at him. "You think I'm going to run. I think you don't know what you're getting into." Gideon's voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, something raw and tired. "This place is dying, Miss Hartley. The boss won't admit it, but it's true. We're drowning in debt, the cattle herd is half what it should be, and every season we lose more ground. A few good meals aren't going to fix that." "You're right," Eliza said calmly. "They won't. But they'll buy you time. And time is what you need to figure out what comes next." "There is no next. There's just surviving until we can't anymore." Eliza stood, balancing on her good leg, and met Gideon's gaze head on. "Is that what you tell yourself every morning? That you're just waiting to fail?" Gideon's jaw tightened. "I tell myself the truth. The truth is that this ranch is still standing. Your boss is still fighting, even if he won't admit it, and your men are still here working because they believe in something." Eliza picked up her crutch and leaned on it, her voice sharp. "So don't you dare tell me there's no next, not while I'm still standing in your kitchen." For a long moment, Gideon just stared at her. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but something close to it. "You've got fire," he said quietly. "I'll give you that." "I've got a lot more than fire, Mr. Pike. But you'll have to stick around to see it." Gideon almost smiled. Almost. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Eliza alone by the well. She sat back down and picked up her knife, her hand steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She'd meant every word she'd said, but deep down, beneath the bravado, a small voice whispered that maybe Gideon was right. Maybe Iron Ridge really was dying, and maybe she was a fool for thinking she could do anything about it. The truth about the ranch's finances came out 2 days later, and it was worse than Eliza had imagined. She'd been working in the kitchen when Caleb walked in, carrying a ledger book that looked like it had survived a war. He set it down on the table without a word and just stood there, staring at it like it was a coiled rattlesnake. "What's this?" Eliza asked. "You said you wanted to see the books." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and sat down. She opened the ledger and began to read, her expression growing darker with every page. The numbers were brutal. Iron Ridge owed money to the bank, to suppliers, to neighboring ranches for borrowed equipment. The cattle sales from last season had barely covered operating costs, and this season's herd was smaller. There were payments listed for things that made no sense, double charges for feed, inflated prices for repairs, mysterious fees that had no explanation. "Who's been managing this?" Eliza asked quietly. "Me." "And before you?" Caleb hesitated. "Anna, my wife. She was good with numbers." Eliza closed the ledger and looked up at him. "Mr. Harrow, someone's been cheating you." Caleb's expression didn't change. "What do you mean?" "These charges." Eliza flipped the book around and pointed to a series of entries. You're being billed twice for the same supplies. And these repair costs are at least 30% higher than they should be. Whoever you've been buying from has been taking advantage. Caleb's hands curled into fists. That's not possible. It's not only possible, it's been happening for months, maybe longer. Eliza stood, leaning on the table. You need to confront your suppliers, renegotiate, and you need to stop trusting people just because they seem honest. I don't have time to, Then make time, Eliza said sharply, because if you don't fix this, you won't have a ranch to worry about. Caleb stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something that looked like anger but felt more like shame. Finally, he picked up the ledger and walked out without another word. Eliza sat back down, her heart pounding. She'd overstepped. She knew she had. But she'd also seen too many good people lose everything because they were too proud or too tired to fight back. Iron Ridge was dying, but it didn't have to. That evening, Caleb rode into town. The ride gave him too much time to think, too much time to remember Anna sitting at the kitchen table, carefully recording every expense, every sale, every dollar earned and spent. She'd been meticulous, organized. She'd kept the ranch running even when the work was hard. After she died, Caleb had tried to keep up with the books. But grief made everything blur. He'd trusted the suppliers because Anna had trusted them. He'd paid the invoices because that's what you did. He'd been a fool. The general store was run by a man named Ernest Polk, a round-faced merchant with a quick smile and a firm handshake. Caleb had been buying from him for 5 years. He'd considered Polk a friend. But when Caleb walked into the store that evening and set the ledger down on the counter, Polk's smile faltered. "Caleb," Polk said carefully, "what brings you in?" "These invoices." Caleb opened the ledger and pointed to the entries Eliza had marked. "You charged me twice for the same shipment in April, and these prices for fence posts are nearly double what they should be." Polk's smile vanished. "Now, Caleb, I'm sure there's been a mistake." "There's no mistake." Caleb's voice was low and dangerous. "You've been overcharging me for months, maybe longer. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Polk sighed and leaned back against the counter, his expression shifting from defensive to resigned. "Look," Polk said quietly, "things have been hard for everyone. I've got bills to pay too. I figured you wouldn't notice a few extra dollars here and there." "A few extra dollars?" Caleb's voice rose. "You've been bleeding me dry. I never meant—" "I don't care what you meant." Caleb slammed the ledger shut. "From now on, I'll be taking my business elsewhere. And if I find out you've been doing this to anyone else, I'll make sure the whole town knows." Polk's face went red. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to. Your reputation will speak for itself." Caleb turned and walked toward the door, then paused. "You should be ashamed, Ernest. I trusted you." He left without waiting for a response. 10. When Caleb returned to Iron Ridge that night, he found Eliza sitting on the porch of the main house, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm evening air. She looked up as he approached, her expression cautious. "How did it go?" she asked. Caleb sat down on the steps beside her, exhausted. "You were right. He admitted it." Eliza nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You saved this ranch from going under even faster than it already is." Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. "I should have seen it. Anna would have seen it." "You were grieving," Eliza said quietly. "People take advantage of grief. It's not your fault." "It feels like my fault." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. Finally, Eliza said, "I found a new supplier 2 towns over. Better prices, honest reputation. I can place an order tomorrow if you want." Caleb looked at her, this strange woman who'd crashed into his life and somehow, in less than a week, had begun to pull Iron Ridge back from the edge of collapse. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Eliza was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "Because I've spent the last 10 years running from places like this. And I'm tired of running. Caleb didn't ask what she was running from. He didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes, the same kind of pain he carried, the kind that didn't fade with time, just learned to wear different faces. "Stay," he said. "Not for a week. Stay as long as you need." Eliza looked at him, surprised. "Your men still don't trust me." "They will. Gideon already does, even if he won't admit it." "And you?" Eliza asked. "Do you trust me?" Caleb met her gaze, steady and honest. "I'm starting to." The next morning, Eliza placed the supply order with the new merchant, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Hastings, who ran a trading post in a town called Red Creek. Clara had a reputation for fair dealing and no-nonsense business, and when Eliza explained the situation at Iron Ridge, Clara's expression turned sympathetic. "Ernest Polk's been pulling that trick for years," Clara said. "He preys on folks who are too busy or too heartbroken to check the numbers. I'm glad someone finally caught him." "He won't be doing it to us again," Eliza said firmly. "Good." Clara wrote up the order: flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, canned goods, and fresh vegetables when available, and promised delivery within the week. "Tell Mr. Harrow I'll treat him fair. That's a promise." When Eliza returned to Iron Ridge that afternoon, she found the ranch in chaos. One of the cattle pens had collapsed overnight, and a dozen head had scattered across the southern pasture. The men were scrambling to round them up before they wandered too far or got injured. Caleb was in the thick of it, riding hard, shouting orders, looking more alive than he had in days. Eliza stood by the fence and watched, her heart pounding with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just admiration, though she did admire the way Caleb moved, the way he commanded respect without demanding it. It was something deeper, a recognition, the same stubborn refusal to quit that she saw in herself. By sunset, the cattle were back in their pen and the fence was being repaired. The men were exhausted but triumphant, and when they filed into the dining hall for supper, there was a new energy in the air, something electric and dangerous and alive. Eliza served them beef stew, fresh bread, and a rhubarb pie that made Finn Garrett nearly weep. "Miss Hartley," Finn said, "if the boss doesn't marry you, I will." The table erupted in laughter. Even Gideon cracked a smile. Caleb, sitting at the head of the table, didn't laugh. He just looked at Eliza, standing in the doorway to the kitchen with flour on her apron and firelight in her eyes, and felt something shift inside him, something he'd thought was buried for good. But the peace didn't last. 3 days later, the sky turned dark and cold, and the wind shifted to the north. The old-timers among the ranch hands started muttering about an early winter, and Caleb felt a knot of dread tighten in his gut. Winter on the Texas frontier was brutal and unpredictable. An early freeze could kill the cattle, destroy the crops, and trap the ranch in months of isolation. And Iron Ridge wasn't ready. "We need to move the herd to lower pasture," Gideon said, standing in Caleb's office with a map spread across the desk. "If the snow comes early, they'll starve up in the hills." "How long will it take?" Caleb asked. 3 days if we push hard, maybe 4. "Then we start tomorrow." Gideon nodded and left, and Caleb sat alone in the office, staring at the map. Moving the herd was risky, even in good weather. If the storm hit while they were out on the range, men could die. But if they didn't move the herd, the ranch would lose everything. That evening, Caleb called a meeting in the dining hall. All 16 men gathered, their faces grim but determined. Eliza stood in the back, leaning on the wall, listening. "We're moving the herd tomorrow," Caleb said. "It's going to be hard, and it's going to be dangerous. If any of you want to sit this out, I won't hold it against you." No one moved. No one spoke. Then Lucas Webb stood. "We're with you, boss." "All of us." One by one, the other men nodded. Even Finn, young and reckless, didn't hesitate. Caleb's throat tightened. "Thank you." After the meeting, Eliza found Caleb outside, standing by the corral, staring at the darkening sky. "You're worried," she said quietly. "I'm terrified." "Good. That means you're smart." Eliza leaned on the fence beside him. "How bad could it get?" "Bad enough that we lose men. Bad enough that we lose the ranch anyway." Caleb's voice was rough. "But if we don't try, we've already lost." Eliza was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll keep things running here while you're gone. Make sure the ranch doesn't fall apart." Caleb looked at her, surprised. You'd do that? I told you, I'm tired of running. Eliza met his gaze, her eyes steady. Come back safe, Mr. Harrow. I'll try. They left at dawn. Caleb, Gideon, and 10 of the best riders took the herd north toward the lower pasture, a brutal 3-day journey across rough terrain. The remaining hands stayed behind to keep the ranch operational, and Eliza took charge of the kitchen and supplies with the efficiency of a battlefield commander. The first day passed without incident. The second day brought rain, cold, driving rain that turned the ground to mud and made every mile feel like 10. By the third day, the temperature had dropped, and the rain turned to sleet. Caleb pushed the men hard, knowing that if they didn't reach the lower pasture before the storm hit in full, they'd be trapped on the open range with no shelter and 1,000 head of panicked cattle. It was Gideon who saw the danger first. "Boss!" he shouted over the wind, pointing toward the northern ridge. "Stampede!" Caleb's blood went cold. A group of cattle had broken away from the herd and were charging toward a narrow canyon, a death trap. If they didn't stop them, the entire herd would follow, and they'd lose everything. "Finn! Lucas!" Caleb shouted. "Cut them off! I'll go around!" He kicked his horse into a gallop, riding hard toward the head of the stampede. The ground was slick, treacherous, and his horse nearly went down twice. But Caleb didn't stop. He couldn't. He reached the lead steer just as it entered the canyon and turned his horse sharply, forcing the animal to veer left. The rest of the breakaway group followed, their panic redirected away from the trap. But then the ground gave way. Caleb felt his horse stumble, felt the sickening lurch as they both went down. He tried to roll clear, but there wasn't time. The weight of the horse landed on his leg, pinning him to the ground. And then the cattle were everywhere, hooves pounding, bodies surging, the world reduced to noise and pain and chaos. He heard someone screaming his name, felt hands grabbing him, dragging him clear. And then everything went dark. Machine. Back at Iron Ridge, Eliza didn't know anything was wrong until the telegram arrived. It came on the 4th day, delivered by a rider from the nearest telegraph office. The message was brief and brutal. Stampede. Multiple injuries. Harrow critical. Dodge City Hospital. Eliza read it 3 times, her hands shaking. Then she folded the telegram, walked calmly to her room, and began packing. "Miss Hartley?" Lucas's voice came from the doorway. He'd stayed behind because of an old injury that made long rides dangerous. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to Dodge City." "That's 3 days hard riding. You're still healing." "I don't care." Lucas stepped into the room, his weathered face etched with concern. "Miss Hartley, Eliza, you can't do this alone." "Then come with me." Lucas stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll saddle the horses." They left within the hour, riding hard through country that grew colder and more unforgiving with every mile. Eliza's injured leg screamed in protest, but she ignored it. All she could think about was Caleb, broken, bleeding, maybe dying, and the fact that she'd told him to come back safe. She'd made a promise to herself 10 years ago, after her daughter died, that she would never care about anyone or anything enough to feel this kind of fear again. But she'd broken that promise, and now she was riding through a storm to save a man who'd somehow, impossibly, made her want to stay. The ride to Dodge City was 3 days of hell. The first night they made camp in a dried riverbed huddled around a fire that barely held against the wind. Eliza's leg had gone from aching to screaming, every jolt of the horse sending fresh waves of pain through her body. But she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. Lucas sat across from her, poking at the fire with a stick, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering flames. "You should rest," he said quietly. "We've got another hard day tomorrow." "I can't sleep." "Try anyway." Eliza pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared into the fire. The telegram had said Caleb was critical. Critical could mean anything: broken bones, internal bleeding, infection. It could mean he was already gone, and they were riding toward nothing but bad news and a funeral. She shook her head, forcing the thought away. Caleb Harrow was too stubborn to die. She had to believe that. "You care about him," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. Eliza didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "He saved my life." "That's not what I asked." She looked up, meeting Lucas's knowing gaze. The old cowboy had been watching her since the day she arrived, reading her the way some men read weather patterns or cattle moods. He saw too much. "I don't know what I feel," Eliza admitted. "I've spent 10 years not feeling anything. It's safer that way." "Safer doesn't mean better." "No," Eliza agreed quietly. "It doesn't." They rode out before dawn the next morning, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. The landscape shifted around them, rolling grassland giving way to harder, rockier terrain, scattered homesteads appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The sky stayed gray, threatening snow, but never quite delivering. By the second night, they'd covered nearly 2/3 of the distance. Eliza could feel her body breaking down, her leg throbbing, her back screaming, exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical weight. But she kept riding. On the morning of the third day, they finally saw Dodge City rising from the plains like a mirage, a sprawl of wooden buildings, dusty streets, and the distant whistle of a train pulling into the station. "Almost there," Lucas said, his voice hoarse from days of riding in silence. Eliza just nodded and kicked her horse faster. The hospital was a low brick building on the edge of town, marked by a simple wooden sign. Eliza dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, her injured leg nearly buckling beneath her as she hit the ground. She caught herself against the hitching post and limped toward the entrance. Inside, the air smelled of carbolic acid and old blood. A nurse looked up from behind a desk, her expression professional but tired. "I'm looking for Caleb Harrow," Eliza said, her voice raw. "He was brought in 3 days ago, stampede injuries." The nurse consulted a ledger, running her finger down the page. "Room 7, down the hall, second door on the left." Eliza didn't wait for more information. She pushed past the desk and half ran, half limped down the narrow hallway, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Room 7 was small and dim, lit by a single oil lamp on a bedside table. And there, lying motionless beneath a thin white sheet, was Caleb. Eliza stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. He looked terrible. His face was bruised and swollen, one eye blackened, his jaw scraped raw. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Bandages covered his left shoulder and wrapped around his torso, and his right leg was splinted and elevated. But he was alive. Eliza crossed the room on unsteady legs and sank into the chair beside the bed. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at him, relief and anger and fear all crashing together inside her chest. "You damn fool," she whispered. "You stupid, reckless damn fool." Caleb didn't respond, didn't move. His breathing stayed shallow and rhythmic, the sound of a man trapped somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. Eliza reached out and took his hand, the one that wasn't bandaged, and held it between both of hers. His skin was warm, real, alive. "You have to wake up," she said quietly. "You have to come back. Because if you don't, I'll never forgive you." Behind her, Lucas appeared in the doorway. He took one look at Caleb and let out a low whistle. "How bad is it?" Eliza asked without turning around. "Bad," Lucas admitted. "But he's breathing. That's something." A doctor arrived a few minutes later, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He introduced himself as Dr. Warren and checked Caleb's vitals with practiced efficiency. "He took a bad blow to the head," Dr. Warren explained. "Cracked ribs, dislocated shoulder, fractured leg. He's lucky to be alive." "When will he wake up?" Eliza asked. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days." The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "The body shuts down after trauma like this. It's protecting itself. All we can do is wait." "Then I'll wait." Dr. Warren studied her for a moment, then nodded. "There's a cot in the storage room. I'll have the nurse bring it in." "Thank you." The doctor left, and Lucas stepped into the room, his hat in his hands. "I'm going to find the others," he said. "Gideon and the boys should still be in town. They'll want to know you're here." Eliza nodded. "Tell them I'm not leaving until he wakes up." "I figured as much." Lucas paused at the door. "You did good, Miss Hartley, riding out here like you did. The boss is lucky to have someone like you fighting for him." After he left, Eliza sat alone in the dim room, listening to the sounds of the hospital. Footsteps in the hallway, the distant murmur of voices, the creak of floorboards settling. She kept Caleb's hand in hers, anchoring herself to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Hours passed. Night fell. The nurse brought the cot as promised, but Eliza didn't use it. She stayed in the chair, keeping watch, afraid that if she closed her eyes even for a moment, Caleb would slip away. Sometime after midnight, his hand twitched in hers. Eliza's eyes snapped open. She hadn't even realized she'd been dozing. She leaned forward, her heart racing. "Caleb?" Another twitch. Then his eyelids fluttered, and slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. For a moment he just stared at the ceiling, confused and disoriented. Then his gaze shifted to Eliza, and recognition flickered across his bruised face. "Eliza?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough as sandpaper. "I'm here." "What?" He tried to sit up and immediately gasped in pain, his face going white. "Don't move," Eliza said sharply, pressing her hand against his good shoulder. "You're hurt. Badly. You need to stay still." Caleb sank back against the pillows, breathing hard. "The herd is fine. Gideon got them to the lower pasture. Everyone made it." "The men?" "A few injuries, but nothing like yours." Eliza's voice softened. "You saved a young rider during the stampede. Nearly got yourself killed doing it." Caleb closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. "Can't lose anyone else." Eliza felt something crack open inside her chest. She tightened her grip on his hand and said, "You almost lost yourself, you stubborn idiot." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "You rode all the way here. 3 days. Your leg is fine." "It wasn't, but that didn't matter." "You told me to come back safe. I'm returning the favor." Caleb opened his eyes again and looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for. It was recognition and gratitude and something deeper, something that made Eliza's pulse quicken and her defenses crumble. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she leaned back in the chair, still holding his hand, and finally let herself breathe. Over the next 3 days, Caleb's condition slowly improved. The swelling in his face went down, his breathing deepened, and the color returned to his skin. Dr. Warren changed his bandages twice a day and declared that while the recovery would be long and painful, Caleb would eventually heal. Eliza never left his side. She slept in the cot when exhaustion forced her to, ate whatever food Lucas brought from the hotel down the street, and spent every waking hour in that small hospital room. They talked sometimes about the ranch, about the herd, about small, inconsequential things that filled the silence. Other times they just sat together, content in the quiet. On the 4th day, Gideon finally came to visit. He stood in the doorway like a man approaching a grave, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. Eliza, who'd been dozing in the chair, woke and started to stand, but Gideon shook his head. "Stay," he said quietly. "I just wanted to see how he's doing." Caleb, who was awake but groggy from laudanum, managed a weak smile. "Still alive, Gideon." "I can see that." Gideon stepped into the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You scared the hell out of us, boss." "Wasn't intentional. Never is." Gideon glanced at Eliza, then back at Caleb. "Miss Hartley rode 3 days to get here. Thought you should know." Caleb's gaze shifted to Eliza, who suddenly found the floor very interesting. "I know," Caleb said softly. Gideon nodded, as if some unspoken understanding had passed between the two men. Then he said, "The herd's settled. The boys are ready to head back to Iron Ridge whenever you are. But Doc says you need at least another week before you can travel." "A week," Caleb repeated, frustration creeping into his voice. "Could be worse. Could be never." Caleb sighed, but didn't argue. Gideon turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Miss Hartley," he said, not looking at her. "You were right. About the ranch. About fighting for it." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "I'm glad you stayed." Before Eliza could respond, Gideon was gone. She sat back in her chair, stunned. Caleb, despite the pain and the drugs, was smiling. "That's as close to an apology as Gideon Pike gets," he said. "I'll take it." That evening, as the sun set beyond the hospital window and painted the room in shades of amber and gold, Caleb finally asked the question Eliza had been dreading. "Why did you really come?" Eliza, who'd been reading aloud from a week-old newspaper, set it aside. For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just stared at her hands, folded in her lap, searching for words that felt true. "I told you," she said finally. "You saved my life." "That's not a reason to ride 3 days through dangerous country on an injured leg." "Then maybe I'm just stupid." "You're a lot of things, Eliza Hartley," Caleb said quietly, "but stupid isn't one of them." Eliza looked up and met his gaze. His eyes were clearer now, less fogged by pain and medicine, and they held hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. "I lost someone," she said, the words coming out slow and careful, like she was pulling splinters from a wound. "A long time ago. My daughter. She was 4. Fever took her in 2 days, and there was nothing I could do." Caleb's expression softened, but he didn't speak. He just listened. "After that," Eliza continued, "I promised myself I'd never stay anywhere long enough to care. Never let anyone get close enough to hurt me again, so I drifted, town to town, ranch to ranch, never more than a few weeks in one place." "What changed?" "Iron Ridge." Eliza's voice was barely above a whisper. "You, the men, that damn dying ranch that refuses to quit." She looked down at her hands again. "When I got the telegram saying you were hurt, maybe dying, I realized I'd broken my own rule. I cared. And caring meant I couldn't just walk away." The room was silent except for the distant sounds of the hospital, footsteps, voices, the rattle of a medicine cart rolling down the hall. Then Caleb said, "I'm glad you broke your rule." Eliza's breath caught. She looked up, and the expression on Caleb's face, open, honest, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen, made something inside her chest break wide open. "I can't promise I'll stay forever," she said. "I don't know if I know how." "I'm not asking for forever," Caleb replied. "Just tomorrow. And maybe the day after that." Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She reached out and took Caleb's hand again, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, it felt like more than comfort. It felt like a choice. A week later, Dr. Warren declared Caleb fit enough to travel, though he warned that the recovery would take months, and that Caleb needed to avoid any strenuous activity. Caleb agreed with the kind of false sincerity that made Eliza roll her eyes. The journey back to Iron Ridge was slow and careful. They traveled in a wagon this time. Caleb propped up on blankets in the back, Gideon driving, and Eliza sitting beside him, one hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The other men had already left days earlier with the herd, eager to return home after weeks on the trail. But Gideon, Lucas, and 2 of the younger hands had stayed behind to escort Caleb safely back. As they traveled south, Caleb told Eliza about the cattle drive, the brutal days, the near misses, the moment when everything went wrong and he thought he was going to die. "I saw the stampede coming," Caleb said, staring up at the canvas roof of the wagon. "And I saw this kid, couldn't have been more than 18, frozen in the saddle. He was going to get trampled." "So you rode in," Eliza said. "Didn't really think about it. Just moved." Caleb shifted, wincing as his broken ribs protested. "Got him clear. Then my horse went down, and everything after that is pretty much a blur." "You're lucky you're not dead." "I know." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't do that again." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "What?" "Don't throw your life away trying to save everyone else. The ranch needs you. Your men need you." She paused, then added softly, "I need you." Caleb reached up and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I'll try." "You'd better." They arrived at Iron Ridge just as the sun was setting, painting the ranch in shades of orange and purple. The men were waiting, all 16 of them lined up in the yard, hats in hands, like soldiers welcoming home a fallen commander. When the wagon rolled to a stop, Finn Garrett stepped forward. "Welcome back, boss," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We missed you." Caleb, who'd never been good with sentiment, just nodded. "Missed you too." Getting Caleb into the house was a careful, painful process that involved 4 men, a lot of cursing, and Eliza barking orders like a field general. Finally, they got him settled in his own bed, the first time he'd slept there in weeks, and left him to rest. Eliza stayed. She sat in the chair beside his bed, the same way she had in the hospital, and watched the lamplight flicker across the walls. The house felt different now. Less empty. Less haunted. "You should sleep," Caleb said. "So should you." "I've been sleeping for a week." "Not well." Caleb smiled despite himself. "Fair point." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Caleb said, "What happens now?" Eliza knew what he was really asking. What happens with us? What happens with the ranch? What happens when the crisis is over and real life comes rushing back? "Now," Eliza said slowly, "we figure out how to keep Iron Ridge alive. The cattle drive money will help, but it's not enough. We need to diversify, find other income streams, maybe start a trade route with the nearby towns, sell eggs, butter, preserved goods, things I can make." "You've been thinking about this." "I've had time." Eliza leaned forward, her expression serious. "The ranch can survive, Caleb, but not the way it's been running. You need to change things. Make the men partners, not just hired hands. Give them a stake in the success." Caleb was quiet for a long time, considering. Then he said, "You're right. I usually am." He laughed, then winced as his ribs protested. "Don't make me laugh. It hurts." "Then stop being stubborn." "That's asking a lot." Eliza smiled and reached out to adjust his blankets, her movements gentle and practiced. When she was done, she sat back and said, "Get some rest. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." "We?" "We," Eliza confirmed. "I'm not going anywhere." Caleb's expression softened. "You mean that?" "I do." And as she said it, Eliza realized it was true. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't planning her escape route. She wasn't counting the days until she could leave. She was thinking about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that might come after. She was thinking about staying. Over the next few weeks, Iron Ridge slowly came back to life. The cattle drive money covered the most pressing debts and bought time to renegotiate the bank loan. Eliza threw herself into organizing the ranch's finances with the intensity of someone waging war. She reworked the budget, established new supplier relationships, and started a small side business, selling preserved goods to nearby homesteads and trading posts. The men, seeing Caleb's near death and Eliza's fierce determination, rallied. They worked harder, complained less, and began to believe again that Iron Ridge might actually survive. Even Gideon, who'd been so resistant to change, started coming to Eliza for advice on ranch management. It wasn't an apology, not in words, but it was an acknowledgement, a truce. Caleb recovered slowly, frustratingly slowly, spending his days doing light work around the ranch and his evenings sitting on the porch with Eliza, talking about everything and nothing. They didn't define what was happening between them. They didn't need to. It was there in the way he looked at her, the way she touched his arm when she passed, the way they moved around each other like two planets caught in the same orbit. One evening, nearly a month after returning from Dodge City, Caleb found Eliza in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough. She was humming something under her breath, a tune he didn't recognize, and her hair was falling out of its braid, dusted with flour. She looked beautiful. "Need help?" Caleb asked. Eliza glanced up, surprised. "You're supposed to be resting." "I've been resting for a month. I'm going out of my mind." "Fine," she gestured to the counter. "You can knead the second batch." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of dough against wood and the crackling of the fire in the stove. Then Caleb said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about making the men partners." Eliza paused, her hands still buried in the dough. "And?" "I think you're right. This ranch shouldn't be mine alone. Not anymore." Caleb shaped his dough into a rough ball and set it aside. "I'm going to offer shares to the men who've stuck with me. Give them a real stake in Iron Ridge's future. That's a big decision." "It's the right decision." Caleb wiped his hands on a towel and turned to face her. "Anna used to say that a ranch is only as strong as the people who believe in it. I forgot that for a while, but you reminded me." Eliza's throat tightened. "She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was." Caleb's voice was quiet but steady. She would have liked you. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the flour-dusted counter. Then Caleb reached out and brushed a streak of flour from Eliza's cheek, his touch gentle. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. Eliza's breath caught. "Me too." Caleb's hand lingered on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Then, slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned in and kissed her. It was soft and tentative, the kiss of two people who'd both been broken and were learning how to be whole again. When they finally pulled apart, Eliza's heart was racing and Caleb was smiling in a way she'd never seen before. Open, unguarded, alive. "We should probably finish the bread," Eliza said, her voice unsteady. "Probably," Caleb agreed. But neither of them moved. They stood there in the warm kitchen, flour on their hands and hope in their hearts. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to be feared. It felt like something worth fighting for. Winter came early that year, just as the old-timers had predicted. The first snow fell in late October, dusting the ranch in white and sending the cattle huddling together for warmth. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes drift down through the gray morning light, and felt a knot of worry tighten in her chest. They'd prepared as best they could, moved the herd to lower pasture, stocked the pantry, reinforced the barn and bunkhouse against the cold. But preparation only went so far when you were fighting a Texas winter with a ranch that was still barely holding together. Behind her, she heard Caleb's uneven footsteps as he entered the kitchen. His leg was still healing, leaving him with a limp that the doctor said might never fully go away. But he refused to use the cane Dr. Warren had given him, stubborn as ever. "It's starting," Eliza said without turning around. Caleb came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "We'll manage." "Will we?" "We have to." He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers in the way that had become natural over the past weeks. "We've come too far to quit now." Eliza squeezed his hand and tried to believe him, but the truth was, Iron Ridge was still drowning. The cattle drive money had bought them time, not salvation. The bank had agreed to extend the loan, but they still owed $15,000 by spring, an impossible sum that hung over the ranch like a guillotine. She'd spent countless nights poring over the ledgers, trying to find some way to make the numbers work. She'd expanded the preserved goods business, established trade routes with 3 nearby towns, and even started selling her bread and pies to a restaurant in Red Creek. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. "There has to be another way," Eliza said quietly. "Something we haven't thought of." Caleb was silent for a long moment, watching the snow fall. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something. It's risky, but it might work." "Tell me." "There's a cattle buyer in Kansas City who's been looking for premium stock. He pays 3 times the normal rate, but he's particular, only wants the best." Caleb turned to face her. "If we could get a select herd north before the worst of winter hits, the profit would cover the debt. Maybe even leave us with enough to expand operations next year." Eliza's stomach dropped. "You're talking about another cattle drive. In winter." "I know. You almost died on the last one. This would be different. Smaller herd, better route, more experienced men." Caleb's jaw was set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "It's dangerous, but it's the only way I can see to save the ranch." "No." The word came out sharper than Eliza intended. She pulled her hand from his and stepped back. "You're still healing. Your leg, your ribs, you can barely walk without limping. You want to ride 1,000 miles through snow and ice?" "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do. You can find another way. You can—" Eliza's voice broke. She pressed her hands against the counter, gripping the edge hard enough to hurt. "I didn't ride 3 days to Dodge City just to watch you kill yourself on another damn cattle drive." Caleb moved closer, his expression pained. "Eliza, don't." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't tell me it'll be fine. Don't tell me you'll be careful, because we both know what happens out there." "Then what do you want me to do?" Caleb's voice rose, frustration bleeding through. "Let the bank take everything? Watch this ranch die while I sit here and do nothing?" "I want you to trust that there are other ways to fight." "There aren't." "Then we make them." They stared at each other across the kitchen, the air between them crackling with tension and fear and something deeper that neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Caleb let out a long breath and ran his hand through his hair. "I have to try," he said quietly. "This ranch is all I have left of Anna, of the life we built. If I lose it, you'll still have the men who stayed loyal. You'll still have this land, even if the bank owns the deed. And you'll still have me." Eliza's voice softened. "But none of that matters if you're dead." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared that if I don't do this, if I don't succeed, I'll have failed her, failed everything we worked for." Eliza crossed the kitchen and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Anna's gone, Caleb, and I know that hurts, but she wouldn't want you to destroy yourself trying to hold on to something that's already changed. The ranch isn't the same as it was. You're not the same, and that's okay. I don't know how to let go." "You don't have to let go. You just have to let it be different." Eliza's thumbs traced the line of his jaw, gentle and sure. "We'll find a way to save Iron Ridge, together, but not like this." For a long moment, Caleb just stood there, his eyes closed, leaning into her touch like a man drowning who'd finally found solid ground. Then he nodded, so slightly it was almost imperceptible. "Okay," he whispered. "We'll find another way." That afternoon, Caleb called a meeting in the dining hall. All 16 men gathered, stamping snow from their boots and warming their hands by the stove. The mood was tense. Everyone knew the ranch was in trouble, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Caleb stood at the head of the table, Gideon on his right, Eliza on his left. He looked at each man in turn, Finn with his perpetual scowl, Lucas with his weathered wisdom, the younger hands who'd proven themselves on the cattle drive, the older ones who'd seen Iron Ridge through better days. "I won't lie to you," Caleb began. "We're in a bad spot. The bank's given us until spring to pay off the debt, and right now, we're short. Way short." A murmur ran through the room. Finn cursed under his breath. Lucas just nodded, as if he'd expected as much. "I've been considering another cattle drive," Caleb continued, "but Miss Hartley convinced me to look at other options first. Smarter options." "What kind of options?" Gideon asked, his voice carefully neutral. Caleb glanced at Eliza, who stepped forward. She'd spent the past 3 hours working out the numbers, and her hands were ink-stained from writing and rewriting projections. "We diversify," Eliza said. "We stop relying solely on cattle and start thinking like a business. We already have a preserved goods trade that's bringing in steady income. We expand that. We plant winter wheat, small crop, but it'll yield come spring. We offer boarding for travelers' horses, since we're on a main trail route. We rent out the southern pasture to neighboring ranches who need extra grazing land." "That's a lot of small income," Finn said skeptically. "How's that supposed to compete with $15,000? "It won't," Eliza admitted. "Not by itself, but combined with one more moderate cattle sale in early spring, it gets us close. Close enough that we can renegotiate the terms with the bank, show them we're building a sustainable operation, and buy more time." "And if the bank says no," another hand asked. "Then we fight harder." Eliza's voice was firm. "But we do it smart. We don't gamble everything on one desperate play." The men exchanged glances, uncertain. Then Lucas stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm in," he said simply. "I've worked ranches my whole life, and I've seen too many go under because the boss bet everything on one hand. This makes sense." One by one, the other men nodded their agreement. Even Finn, after a long moment of consideration, grunted his assent. Gideon was the last to speak. He looked at Caleb, his expression unreadable, then said, "You're changing everything Anna built." The room went silent. Caleb's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Eliza spoke. "No," she said quietly. "He's saving what Anna built. There's a difference." Gideon held her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right, let's get to work." The weeks that followed were brutal. The men divided into teams, each tackling a different aspect of the diversification plan. Lucas took charge of the winter wheat planting, working with the younger hands to prepare the southern fields. Finn and 2 others built a proper boarding stable for travelers' horses, complete with heated stalls and a tack room. Gideon negotiated the pasture rental with a neighboring rancher, driving a hard bargain that left both parties satisfied. And Eliza threw herself into expanding the preserved goods operation with the intensity of someone fighting a war. She woke before dawn every morning and worked until long after dark, her hands raw from peeling vegetables and stirring massive pots of jam and pickles. She taught two of the ranch hands how to help her, turning the kitchen into a small production line. She haggled with merchants, established new trade routes, and even convinced the restaurant in Red Creek to feature her pies as a specialty item. The money came in slowly at first, $5 here, $10 there, but it came. And every dollar was carefully recorded in the ledger, proof that Iron Ridge was more than just a dying cattle ranch. Caleb watched it all with a mixture of awe and growing affection. Eliza had become the heart of the operation, the person everyone turned to when things got difficult. She solved problems with creativity and stubbornness, refused to accept defeat, and somehow made the impossible feel achievable. One night in late November, Caleb found her in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. She was sitting at the table, surrounded by jars of preserves, her head in her hands, looking more exhausted than he'd ever seen her. "Eliza." She looked up, startled, and quickly wiped at her eyes. "I'm fine, just tired." Caleb crossed the room and sat down beside her. "You're working yourself to death. We need the money. We need you more." He reached out and took her hand, turning it over to reveal the blisters and burns that marked her palms. "You can't keep doing this." "Yes, I can." "No, you can't." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "You're one person, Eliza. You can't save the ranch by yourself." "I have to try." Her voice broke, and suddenly the tears she'd been holding back spilled over. If this fails, then what was the point? What was the point of staying, of caring, of—" She didn't finish, but she didn't have to. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she cried against his chest, great shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and raw and long buried. "You've already done more than anyone could ask," Caleb said quietly, his hand stroking her hair. "The ranch is surviving because of you. The men believe again because of you, and I—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm alive because of you." Eliza pulled back, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so tired, Caleb. Tired of fighting. Tired of being scared that I'll lose everything again." "I know." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "But you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry this by yourself." "I don't know how to not carry it." "Then let me teach you." Caleb leaned forward and kissed her forehead, soft and reverent. "Let us share the weight." For a long moment, Eliza just sat there in his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke, and something uniquely his. Then she nodded against his chest and let herself simply be held. By December, the diversification plan was showing real results. The preserved goods business was generating $200 a month. The pasture rental brought in another $100. The boarding stable was attracting regular customers, adding 50 more. Combined with careful budgeting and the remaining cattle drive money, Iron Ridge was no longer hemorrhaging resources. It still wasn't enough to cover the full debt, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress. The mood on the ranch shifted. The men worked with renewed purpose, taking pride in the fact that they were building something sustainable rather than just fighting to survive another season. Even the bunkhouse felt different, warmer, louder, filled with the kind of rough camaraderie that came from shared purpose. One evening in mid-December, Gideon approached Caleb in the barn. The two men had been mending tack in companionable silence when Gideon set down his tools and said, "I owe Miss Hartley an apology." Caleb looked up, surprised. "What for?" "For doubting her, for thinking she'd quit like the others." Gideon's weathered face was serious. "She's got more spine than most men I know, and she's saved this ranch as surely as if she'd paid off the debt herself." "I know." "You planning to marry her?" Caleb nearly dropped the bridle he was holding. "What?" "Don't play dumb, boss. Everyone can see the way you look at her, the way she looks at you." Gideon's expression softened slightly. "Anna would have wanted you to be happy again." We haven't—" Caleb struggled for words, his face flushing. "It's complicated. Life's always complicated. Doesn't mean you should wait forever." Gideon picked up his tools and headed for the door, then paused. Just think about it. That woman's not going to wait around forever while you figure out what you want. After Gideon left, Caleb sat alone in the barn, turning the foreman's words over in his mind. Marriage. He hadn't thought about it, hadn't let himself think about it. After Anna died, he'd assumed that part of his life was over, that he'd spend whatever years remained alone, tending a ranch and carrying his grief like a stone in his chest. But Eliza had changed everything. She'd stormed into his life on a dust storm and somehow convinced him that the future wasn't something to be feared. That love wasn't a betrayal of the past, but a testament to it. And if he was honest with himself, he'd been in love with her for weeks now, maybe longer. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Christmas came quietly to Iron Ridge. Eliza had never been one for holidays. They reminded her too much of what she'd lost. But the men insisted on marking the occasion. They strung paper decorations in the dining hall, pooled their money to buy a small turkey from town, and even convinced Finn to drag in a scraggly pine tree from the hills. On Christmas Eve, the entire ranch gathered for dinner. Eliza had outdone herself, preparing a feast that made the men fall silent with appreciation. Roasted turkey with sage stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans with bacon, fresh bread, and 3 kinds of pie. Miss Hartley, Lucas said solemnly, raising his cup of cider, you are a miracle worker. Here, here, the men chorused, raising their own cups. Eliza, standing in the kitchen doorway, felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. These rough, weathered men who'd started as strangers had become something like family, and this failing ranch that she'd stumbled into by accident had become something like home. After dinner, someone produced a harmonica, and soon the dining hall filled with music, old frontier songs, melancholy ballads, and a few surprisingly bawdy tunes that made Eliza laugh despite herself. The men sang with more enthusiasm than skill, their voices rough but genuine. Caleb found her standing outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. You should be inside, he said, coming to stand beside her. It's cold. I needed air. Eliza glanced at him. This is nice. What you've all built here. We built it together. No, Eliza said softly. You built it. I just helped keep it from falling apart. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. I want to show you something, he said. Eliza took the box, curious, and opened it. Inside was a simple gold ring set with a small blue stone. Turquoise, she thought, or maybe aquamarine. It was Anna's, Caleb said. Her mother's before that. She wore it every day until... He stopped, his voice catching. I found it in her things after she died. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, but I kept it. Eliza closed the box carefully and tried to hand it back, but Caleb shook his head. I'm not showing it to you because I'm holding on to the past, he said. I'm showing it to you because I'm ready to let it be part of the future. My future. Our future if... He took a breath, his expression vulnerable in the moonlight. If you'll have me. Eliza's heart stopped. Caleb, I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I also know that I love you, Eliza Hartley. I love your stubbornness and your strength, and the way you refuse to quit even when everything's falling apart. I love that you saved this ranch and saved me, and somehow made me believe in tomorrow again. He took her hands in his. Marry me. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. When you're ready. When the ranch is stable. When you're sure this is what you want. But know that I'm asking, and I'll keep asking until you say yes. Eliza stared at him, her vision blurring with tears. For 10 years, she'd run from this feeling, this terrifying, beautiful possibility of loving someone enough to stay. She'd convinced herself that caring meant losing, that attachment meant pain, that the only way to survive was to keep moving. But standing here on this porch, with this stubborn, beautiful man holding her hands and offering her a future she'd thought was lost forever, she realized something. Running hadn't protected her. It had just made her lonely. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. What if I lose you? What if something happens and then we'll have had whatever time we had? and it'll still be worth it. Caleb's voice was steady, certain. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Eliza. But I'd rather spend 1 year truly living with you than 50 years just surviving without you. Eliza looked down at their joined hands, at the calluses and scars that marked both their palms, proof of hard work and harder years. Then she looked back up at Caleb and felt something shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for too long. "Yes?" she said. Caleb blinked. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Not someday. Not when the ranch is stable, or when I'm sure, or when everything's perfect." Eliza's voice grew stronger. "I'll marry you now, soon. Because you're right. Life doesn't come with guarantees, and I'm done wasting time being scared." For a moment, Caleb just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and fierce and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eliza laughed, a sound of pure, unexpected joy. "We're insane," she said. "The ranch is still in debt, winter's barely started, and we're planning a wedding." "Probably," Caleb agreed, grinning, "but at least we're insane together." Inside the dining hall, the men were still singing, their voices carrying across the cold December air. And standing on the porch of Iron Ridge, wrapped in each other's arms, Caleb and Eliza listened to the sound of hope refusing to die. The news of the engagement spread through the ranch like wildfire. By morning, every man on Iron Ridge knew that Caleb Harrow had proposed to Eliza Hartley on Christmas Eve, and that she'd said yes. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Backslapping, congratulations, and a level of genuine happiness that took both Caleb and Eliza by surprise. "About damn time," Finn said, grinning wider than anyone had ever seen. "We were starting to think you'd never figure it out, boss." Even Gideon, stoic as ever, cracked what might have been a smile. "Congratulations," he said simply, shaking Caleb's hand. Then he turned to Eliza and added, "You're getting a good man, stubborn, but good." "I know," Eliza replied, her eyes bright. But beneath the celebration, the reality of their situation loomed. The ranch was still in debt, winter was deepening, and they had less than 3 months to prove to the bank that Iron Ridge was worth saving. A wedding seemed almost absurdly optimistic in the face of such uncertainty, yet somehow that made it feel even more important. The first week of January brought bitter cold and a crisis that tested everything they'd built. A late-night blizzard swept across the plains without warning, burying the ranch under 2 feet of snow and driving the temperature so low that water froze in the troughs within hours. The cattle huddled together in the lower pasture, their breath steaming in the frigid air, while the men worked around the clock to keep them alive. Caleb was in the thick of it, ignoring his still healing leg as he helped break ice, distribute hay, and check for frostbite among the herd. Eliza wanted to order him back to the house, but she knew better. This was what Caleb did. He led from the front, even when it cost him. On the third night of the blizzard, one of the younger hands came running to the main house, his face white with panic. "Miss Hartley, we need you in the barn!" Eliza grabbed her coat and followed him out into the storm. The wind cut through her clothes like knives, and the snow was so thick she could barely see 3 feet ahead. When they reached the barn, she found Caleb kneeling beside a collapsed cow, his hands covered in blood. "She's trying to calve," Caleb said, his voice tight. "But something's wrong. The calf's breech." Eliza had seen enough difficult births on the ranches she'd worked to know how bad this could get. If they couldn't turn the calf, both mother and baby would die. And in a herd this small, losing even one cow could mean the difference between survival and failure. "What do you need?" she asked. "Hot water, clean towels, and pray this works." For the next 2 hours, Caleb and Gideon worked to save the cow, while Eliza and the others kept the water coming and the barn as warm as possible. It was brutal, messy work, the kind that tested patience and skill in equal measure. Finally, just when Eliza thought they'd lost both animals, the calf slipped free in a rush of fluid and blood. It lay still for a moment, and Eliza's heart sank. But then Caleb rubbed it vigorously with a towel, and the calf took a shuddering breath and let out a weak cry. The mother cow, exhausted but alive, turned her head and began licking her newborn clean. Caleb sat back on his heels, his face pale with exhaustion and relief. "We did it." Gideon, who'd been holding the cow steady, let out a long breath. That was close. Eliza knelt beside Caleb and put her hand on his shoulder. You should rest. Can't. Still have to check the rest of the herd. Then I'm coming with you. They worked until dawn, moving from barn to pasture and back again, making sure every animal had survived the night. By the time the sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered ranch in shades of pink and gold, they were all frozen and exhausted. But they'd made it. The herd had survived. Iron Ridge had survived. That morning, as they gathered in the kitchen for hot coffee and whatever food Eliza could scrape together, Caleb stood and cleared his throat. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes next, about how we keep this ranch alive. The men looked up, tired but attentive. We've done good work these past months, Caleb continued. The diversification plan is working. We're bringing in steady income. But it's not enough to pay off the debt, and we all know it. So what are you saying? Finn asked. I'm saying that this ranch shouldn't belong to me alone anymore. Not when all of you have fought this hard to save it. Caleb's voice was firm. I'm offering shares, equal partnership to every man who stays. When we pay off the bank, Iron Ridge won't be my ranch. It'll be our ranch. The room went dead silent. Then Lucas stood slowly, his weathered face solemn. That's a hell of an offer, boss. It's the right offer. Caleb met each man's gaze in turn. You've earned it. Every one of you. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Gideon stood, followed by Finn, and then the rest of the men one by one, until everyone was on their feet. We're in, Gideon said simply. All of us. The men nodded, and something passed through the room, a silent understanding that they were no longer just hired hands working for wages. They were partners. Family. Men with something real to fight for. Eliza, watching from the doorway, felt tears prick at her eyes. This was what she'd been fighting for. Not just the ranch's survival, but its transformation into something worth surviving for. January gave way to February, and the work intensified. The preserved goods business expanded to 4 towns, with Eliza training 3 of the ranch hands to help with production. The boarding stable was averaging 15 horses a week, generating reliable income. The winter wheat was growing strong in the southern fields, promising a solid harvest come spring. But the numbers, despite all their efforts, still fell short. By mid-February, Eliza calculated that they'd have about $12,000 by the bank's deadline, $3,000 short of what they owed. She sat in Caleb's office late one night, staring at the ledger, trying to find some way to bridge the gap. Maybe they could sell more cattle. Maybe they could take out a smaller loan to cover the difference. Maybe... You're going to give yourself gray hair, Caleb said from the doorway. Eliza looked up, exhausted. We're still short. I know. $3,000. We've worked so hard, and we're still $3,000 short. Her voice cracked with frustration. I don't know what else to do. Caleb crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. We'll figure it out. How? I don't know yet, but we will. He squeezed her hands gently. Come to bed, Eliza. The numbers aren't going to change tonight. She wanted to argue, but she was too tired, so she let him lead her upstairs to the room they'd been sharing since Christmas and collapsed into bed fully clothed. The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 days later, a stranger rode into Iron Ridge, a tall, elegant woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She introduced herself as Margaret Brennan, owner of the defunct Brennan Ranch that bordered Iron Ridge to the east. Caleb received her in the parlor, Eliza at his side, curious and cautious in equal measure. Mr. Harrow, Margaret began, accepting the tea Eliza offered. I've heard about your diversification efforts. The preserved goods, the boarding stable, the wheat crop. Impressive work, especially given your circumstances. Thank you, Caleb said carefully. What brings you here, Mrs. Brennan? A business proposition. Margaret set down her teacup and leaned forward. My family lost our ranch 5 years ago. We moved to Denver, but I've kept track of the properties in this area. I know you're facing a bank deadline, and I know you're short on capital. Eliza's stomach tightened. How do you know that? I make it my business to know. The question is, are you interested in a partnership? Caleb exchanged a glance with Eliza. What kind of partnership? I have investment capital and business connections throughout the territory. You have operational knowledge and a working ranch. Margaret's eyes were sharp but not unkind. I'm proposing a three-way partnership. You, me, and your ranch hands. I provide the funds you need to satisfy the bank, plus additional capital for expansion. In return, I take a 20% stake in Iron Ridge and help you establish larger trade routes for your goods. 20%, Caleb repeated. It's fair, considering the alternative is losing everything. Margaret pulled out a document from her satchel. I've had my lawyer draft the terms. You'd maintain majority control, your men would keep their shares, and I'd provide $3,000 in immediate funding plus another $5,000 for expansion over the next year. Eliza's mind raced. It was almost too good to be true, which meant she needed to look for the catch. Why us? Why now? Margaret smiled slightly. Because I made mistakes that cost my family our legacy. I watched our ranch die because we were too proud to adapt, too stubborn to accept help. I don't want to see Iron Ridge go the same way. She paused. And because I believe in what you're building here. Not just a cattle ranch, but a community. Something sustainable. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, reading through the contract Margaret had provided. Finally, he looked up. I need to discuss this with my men. Can you give us 24 hours? Of course. Margaret stood, collecting her things. Take the time you need. But know that my offer expires in 3 days. After that, I'm considering a ranch in New Mexico. After she left, Caleb and Eliza sat in the parlor, both lost in thought. What do you think? Caleb asked. I think it's the answer we've been praying for, Eliza said slowly. But I also think we need to be careful. 20% is significant. So is losing everything. True. Eliza stood and began pacing. We should talk to the men, see what they think. This affects all of them now. That evening, they called another meeting. Caleb laid out Margaret's proposal in detail, showing the men the contract and the financial projections. Then he opened the floor for discussion. The debate was intense. Some men, like Lucas, saw it as their salvation. Others, like Finn, worried about losing control to an outsider. Gideon, characteristically, said little, just listened and watched. Finally, after an hour of back and forth, Gideon spoke. The way I see it, we've got two choices, he said. We can hold on to 100% of a ranch that won't exist in 3 months, or we can take 80% of a ranch that has a real future. He looked around the table. I say we take the deal. One by one, the men nodded their agreement. Even Finn, after a long moment, raised his hand in assent. Caleb looked at Eliza, and she nodded. Do it. The next morning, Caleb rode out to meet Margaret Brennan and signed the partnership agreement. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. With the investment capital, they paid off the bank in full and still had funds left over for the expansion projects they'd been planning. The pressure that had been crushing them for months lifted like fog burning off under the morning sun. But more than the money, what mattered was what it represented. Iron Ridge wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving, growing, becoming something new. The wedding was planned for early March in the small valley chapel that overlooked the ranch. Eliza had never been one for elaborate ceremonies, and neither had Caleb. They wanted something simple, just the ranch hands, a few neighbors, and a promise made in front of the people who mattered. Clara Hastings, the merchant from Red Creek who'd become a friend, helped Eliza find a dress. Nothing fancy, just a simple cream-colored gown with lace sleeves that made her feel both beautiful and like herself. Caleb wore a new suit that the men had pooled money to buy him, looking uncomfortable but handsome. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with a brilliant blue sky that seemed to promise better days ahead. The chapel was small and drafty, but someone had filled it with wildflowers and candles, transforming the plain wooden interior into something almost magical. As Eliza walked down the aisle on Lucas's arm, the old cowboy had insisted on giving her away. She looked at Caleb standing at the altar and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked her over. This man who'd saved her life in a dust storm and given her a reason to stop running. This man who'd shown her that love wasn't something to fear, but something to fight for. The ceremony was brief and honest. They exchanged simple vows, promises to stand together, to fight for each other, to build a life worth living. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that made the gathered crowd erupt in applause and whistles. At the reception in the dining hall, the men outdid themselves. They'd prepared a feast, decorated the space with paper garlands and ribbons, and even convinced a traveling musician to play fiddle for dancing. The celebration went on for hours, food and music and laughter that echoed through the ranch like a promise fulfilled. Late in the evening, Caleb and Eliza slipped outside for a moment of quiet. They stood on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Mrs. Harrow," Caleb said, testing out the name. Eliza smiled against his chest. "That's going to take some getting used to. We've got time." He pulled back to look at her. "A lifetime, in fact." "A lifetime," Eliza repeated, and this time the words didn't frighten her. They filled her with something bright and warm and unshakable. Hope. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and turning the fields green with new growth. The winter wheat harvest exceeded expectations, bringing in enough profit to fund the next phase of expansion. The preserved goods business was now supplying 8 towns, with orders coming in faster than they could fill them. The boarding stable had become so popular that they were building a second barn. And Iron Ridge, the ranch that had been dying just months before, was alive again, not as it had been, but as something new and stronger. Margaret Brennan proved to be an invaluable partner. She used her business connections to establish trade routes throughout the territory, secured premium prices for their cattle, and helped negotiate contracts that ensured steady income for years to come. More than that, she brought wisdom and perspective, a reminder that success wasn't about holding on to the past, but about building toward the future. By late April, the ledgers showed Iron Ridge solidly in the black for the first time in 3 years. The men had steady work, fair wages, and a real stake in the ranch's success. The community had grown to include not just the original 16 hands, but their families, wives, children, relatives who saw opportunity in what Iron Ridge was becoming. One warm afternoon in May, Caleb gathered everyone in the yard for an announcement. The entire ranch community was there. Men, women, children, all gathered to hear what he had to say. "When I started this ranch with Anna," Caleb began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "we had a dream of building something that would last, something that mattered. For a while, after she died, I lost sight of that dream. I let this place start to die because I couldn't see past my grief." He paused, and Eliza, standing beside him, squeezed his hand. "But then someone showed up in a dust storm and reminded me what it means to fight," Caleb continued, looking at Eliza with open affection. "She reminded all of us. And together, we built something better than what was lost. Not the same, better. Because it's ours. All of ours." He pulled out a document from his coat. "This is the new ranch charter. It officially establishes Iron Ridge as a cooperative partnership. Every person who works here, who invests their labor and loyalty, earns a stake in our success. This isn't my ranch anymore. It's our home." The crowd erupted in cheers. Children ran through the yard, laughing. Women embraced. Men shook hands and clapped each other on the back. And Caleb stood in the middle of it all, watching the community he'd helped build, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. That night, as Caleb and Eliza prepared for bed, she caught him staring at the window, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything." He turned to face her. "How close we came to losing all this. How different things could have been if you hadn't stayed." "But I did stay." "Why?" Caleb asked. "Really? Why? You could have left a dozen times, could have walked away when things got hard." Eliza was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, "Because somewhere between that first meal and now, Iron Ridge stopped being a place I was staying and became a place I belonged. And I hadn't belonged anywhere in 10 years. She crossed the room and took his hands. "You gave me that, Caleb. You and this stubborn ranch and those loyal men. You gave me a home." Caleb pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "You gave me something too. You gave me permission to live again." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet darkness, grateful for the journey that had brought them here. Summer arrived with all its demands: cattle to move, crops to tend, goods to produce. The work was endless, but it was good work, purposeful work. the kind of labor that built calluses and character in equal measure. Eliza's preserved goods had become locally famous, with merchants traveling from as far as Kansas City to place orders. She'd trained 6 people to help with production, turning the kitchen into a bustling operation that rivaled small factories in efficiency. The boarding stable was booked solid through the fall, with travelers specifically planning their routes to include a stop at Iron Ridge. Gideon had taken charge of the operation, discovering an unexpected talent for hospitality beneath his gruff exterior, and the cattle herd, carefully managed and well-fed, had grown to nearly double its size from the previous year. In August, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She sat in the kitchen one morning, her hand on her still flat stomach, trying to process the mix of joy and terror flooding through her. After losing her first daughter, she'd never imagined having another child, had never let herself want it for fear of the pain that might follow. But now, sitting in the warm kitchen of Iron Ridge with the sounds of the ranch waking up around her, she let herself feel it, all of it, the hope and the fear and the overwhelming love for this tiny life growing inside her. When she told Caleb that evening, he went pale, then red, then pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sure." A baby. He pulled back to look at her, wonder and worry fighting for dominance on his face. How do you feel?" "Terrified," Eliza admitted, "and happy and scared and grateful." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "Mostly grateful." Caleb's eyes filled with tears, and he didn't try to hide them. "We're going to be parents." "We are." That night they lay in bed talking about the future, about names and nurseries and all the small, ordinary miracles that came with raising a child. And for the first time since losing her daughter, Eliza let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Winter came again, as it always did, but this time Iron Ridge was ready. The barns were reinforced, the pantries stocked, the cattle moved to shelter before the first snow fell. The community had grown to nearly 30 people, all working together with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. And in the main house, Caleb and Eliza prepared for the arrival of their child. The baby came on a cold March morning just as the first signs of spring were beginning to appear. The birth was long and difficult, but when Eliza finally held her daughter, tiny, perfect, screaming with the fury of someone determined to live, she felt something break open inside her chest. Not grief this time. Release. She'd been carrying the weight of her first daughter's death for 10 years, letting it shape every decision, every relationship, every moment of her life. But holding this new life in her arms, looking down at her daughter's scrunched face and tiny fists, Eliza finally understood something. Loving again didn't diminish what she'd lost. It honored it. "She's beautiful," Caleb whispered, sitting beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders. "She is," Eliza agreed. "What should we name her?" They'd discussed names for months, unable to agree on anything. But now, looking at their daughter, Caleb said, "Hope. We should name her Hope." Eliza looked at him, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. "Hope. Yes. That's perfect." That spring, as Iron Ridge bloomed with new life and renewed purpose, Eliza stood in the kitchen where everything had begun. Hope was strapped to her chest in a sling, sleeping peacefully, while Eliza kneaded bread dough with practiced ease. Through the window, she could see Caleb working with the men in the yard, his limp barely noticeable now, his laughter carrying across the ranch. She could see the children playing by the barn, the women tending the garden, the whole community moving together in harmony. This was what she'd been running from for so long. This feeling of belonging, of being needed, of mattering to people, and having them matter to her. And now, standing in this warm kitchen with her daughter sleeping against her heart and her husband visible through the window, Eliza finally understood what home meant. It wasn't a place you found. It was something you built, brick by stubborn brick, meal by hard-won meal, choice by frightening choice. She'd come to Iron Ridge to repay a debt. Instead, she'd found a life worth living, a man worth loving, a community worth fighting for. And standing there in the kitchen, flour on her hands and joy in her heart, Eliza Harrow knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ranch that had been dying was alive again, stronger than ever. The man who'd been drowning in grief had learned to breathe, and the woman who'd spent 10 years running had finally found a reason to stay. Iron Ridge endured, not because it was lucky, but because the people who called it home refused to let it die. They fought for it with everything they had, their labor, their loyalty, their love, and in the end, that made all the difference.